I'm Laura Bloomberg. I'm the Dean of the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, and I would like to add my welcome to those of the speakers this morning. I'm so glad to see all of you here, and I'm so happy that the school, particularly the Wilkins Center under the leadership of Dr. Sam Myers, is partnering with the National League of Cities, the Russell Sage Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and especially the Wilder School to bring this conference to fruition. I've long been looking forward to this. I've long been looking forward to seeing what two people who I greatly admire can do when they co-chair something like that. This, Susan Gooden and Sam Myers, and I think they have done a remarkable job, and I think we should give them a round of applause. I'm also so pleased to see in the room journalists and academics, elected officials, current and past, and a number of concerned citizens from all walks of life and from many generations. It's so important to me, particularly maybe in 2018, when we have this great opportunity to look back half a century at so many things that happened in and around 1968. It's so important to me that we do this in a multi-generational way. And it makes me oftentimes think about one of my favorite words of wisdom from John Dewey, who is an educational theorist, and which is my background, and I think I've read just about everything that John Dewey ever wrote. And it's a simple line, but he said often about education, I think it's relevant to today, that we really don't learn from our experiences. We learn from making the time to reflect on those experiences. And I think that's very apt. So we use this opportunity of 50 years in a powerful way, and I'm glad that we're doing it here today. I'm also very proud. And right now, I'm also very proud to have the opportunity to introduce somebody that I have long admired. United States Senator Fred Harris is with us today. Senator Harris is twice elected to the United States Senate from the great state of Oklahoma that we all now stipulate is in fact in the United States, right? A little inside joke there. And like the namesake of this school, Hubert Humphrey, Senator Harris really has devoted his life to fighting for race equity and social justice. Senator Harris was a very active member and now soberly the only surviving member of President Lyndon Johnson's National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders that came to be known as the Kerner Commission. And he was partly appointed at Senator Harris's urging. As national chair of the Democratic Party in 1969 and 70, Senator Harris caused reform of the party to make it, he really made it happen, to make it democratic and fully representative of women and minorities. We have him to thank for a lot of change that was initiated during that time. He was thereafter an influential 1976 populist Democratic candidate for President of the United States, and here I stop to tell you, no joke, I just told the senator this, I was a freshman in high school and my charge was to write an honors social studies paper on the topic of my choice of a political sort, and I wrote my paper on the candidacy of Senator Fred Harris. Somewhere in my piles of paper from high school is that report where I carefully drew the outline of Oklahoma in the middle of the page. I remember that in case people didn't know it was in the United States. Anyway, currently Senator Harris is widely published author and professor emeritus of political science at the University of New Mexico, where he continues to teach in the Fred Harris Congressional Internship program. Senator Harris continues to be a citizen and political activist. He's produced multiple publications focused on politics, government, and policy, and has been co-editor of the recently published Healing Our Divided Society, a 50th anniversary report on the update of the Kerner Commission study. Before we hear from Senator Harris, which is something I've been looking forward to for months as we've planned this conference, I'd like to point out that on your tables you have note cards and pencils. What we would like to do is to invite you to write your questions for Senator Harris on those cards, and we will have people come around and pick them up so that when the senator is done speaking, we can gather all of your cards, and I will have the tough job of trying to combine questions to make sure that we can get to as many of them as possible in the time that we have. because I know you'll have many questions. One of the things we often do here is also compile all of the questions later, because it's very interesting to know who, when you come into this space, we're hearing from and what is most on your mind and what's most important to you. So please do write your questions on the cards. And with that, please join me in welcoming to the podium Senator Fred Harris.
Thank you very much. There was a guy who wrote a master's thesis, one on my presidential campaign, I think somewhat different from Dean Bloomberg's. And he started off by saying, you didn't have to be crazy to be in the Fred Harris campaign, but it helped. I think maybe it also reminds me, talking about running for president, I was some years ago teaching and living in London, and in this class I was teaching, about halfway through it, I thought by then everybody pretty much knew by background. And to illustrate some point, I said, when I ran for president, and this young woman, she was from Iowa too, she almost jumped out of her chair. She said, "You ran for president?" And I said, "Yes, I did." She said, "President of what?" I said, "President of the United States." She said, "President of the United States?" I said, "Yes, and I should tell you that I was not elected." She wrote that down. Well, many thanks to Dean Bloomberg and Professor Myers and the Wilder Center, Roy Wilkins Center, the Humphrey School of Public Affairs for sponsoring this excellent conference on the 50th anniversary of the report of the Kerner Commission, of which, as you know, I was a member, of course. The last surviving member, my old populist Democratic friend, Jim Hightower, after that appeared in the paper somewhere that I was the last surviving member, he said, "That ought to be on your tombstone." He sent me an email, "Fred Harris, last survivor." Nice sentiment, but I thought it might come a little late. What I'm about to say in the beginning, too, here sounds sort of like politicians do, ingratiating themselves. They always ingratiate themselves or try to with whatever group they're speaking to. You know, they say, "My fellow Rotarians," or "My fellow Rainbow Girls," or whatever it is. But this is not really that. I am honored to be at the Roy Wilkins Center. Roy Wilkins was a diligent and influential member of the Kerner Commission, a great man with whom it was my proud privilege to serve. I'm also especially honored to be here in what's called the Joan and Walter Mondale Commons. Senator Mondale was one of my two Senate seatmates and one of my two closest Senate friends. And I'm especially honored also to be here at the Humphrey School. Hubert Humphrey was my very close friend. Mondale and I, Senator Mondale and I, were his co-chairs of his campaign when he ran for president. And we were, of course, Humphrey's Senate colleagues later when he returned to the United States Senate. I've been asked to speak today about the origins and operations of the Kerner Commission, as well as where we are now on the issues of race and poverty, and what can and should be done about these intertwined issues today, 50 years after the Kerner Report. And I should mention that there is an excellent recent book, Separate and Unequal, by Dr. Stephen Gillen, which details the history and inner workings of the Kerner Commission, including much of which I'm about to relate. On the evening of July 27, 1968, my wife and I, or 1967, My wife and I were gathered with a couple of invited friends in front of a television set we'd brought into our living room to watch President Lyndon Johnson's nationwide broadcast, during which he was expected to announce the appointment of a Blue Ribbon Citizens Commission, what became the President's National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, called the Kerner Commission, after its chairman, Governor Otto Kerner of Illinois. The presidential broadcast was announced, as you know, in the wake of the terrible riots and violent protests which had exploded in the black sections of many of America's cities during the long, hot summer of 1967, with great loss of life, awful human injury, and enormous property destruction, which caused throughout the country great shock, fear, alarm, bewilderment, and anxiety. The worst disorders in Newark and Detroit were not to be finally quelled until the president had sent in U.S. Army troops. My wife and I and friends were seated in front of the television set that July 1967, when not more than 10 minutes before the president was supposed to come on, my youngest daughter, Laura, then in the second grade, came running in from the kitchen where we had a wall telephone and said, "Daddy, President Johnson is on the phone for you." That caused a little stir in the living room. I went into the kitchen and, standing at attention, took the phone and I said, "Yes, sir, Mr. President." He said, "Fred, I hope you're going to watch television tonight." I said, "I was." He said, "I'm going to appoint that commission you've been talking about." He actually said, "I'm going to appoint that damn commission you've been talking about." Flashback. I was then a United States Senator, of course, and 3 days earlier, when the Detroit riots were at their worst, after getting my friend and seatmate Senator Mondale to co-sponsor it with me, I introduced in the Senate a resolution to create a Blue Ribbon Citizens Commission to look into the riots, not just from a law and order standpoint, but also to get at fundamental causes and to come up with recommendations. Quote, "to make good the promise of America for all Americans immediately." I had the resolution sent to the subcommittee which I chaired, and I held hearings on it the very next morning, my witnesses being Daniel Patrick Moynihan, not then a senator, and Whitney Young, head of the Urban League. But then it dawned on me that we didn't have to wait for congressional action, that President Johnson could himself name the commission by executive order. I called Douglas Cater of the White House staff and urged such presidential action, following up the call, as Cater asked me to, with a hand-delivered formal letter to the president. So back now to President Johnson's telephone call to me. He said, "I'm going to appoint that commission you've been talking about." I said I was glad to hear it. He said, "I'm going to put you on it." I said, "I didn't expect that, but I do my best." He said, and all this is word for word, "Now don't you be like some of your colleagues. I appoint them to things and they don't show up." I said, "I'd show up." And another thing, Fred, President Johnson said, I said, "Yes, sir, Mr. President." He said, "I want you to remember that you're a Johnson man." I said, "Yes, sir, I am a Johnson man." The president said, "If you forget it, I'm going to take my pocket knife and cut your blank off." He did not say blank. Sadly, by the time our report came out, the president thought I had forgotten I was a Johnson man. Back now, though, to July 29th, 1967. On that day, the 11 members of the commission were called together by telegram. We met in the White House Cabinet Room with President Johnson, Vice President Hubert Humphrey, Attorney General Ramsey Clark, Budget Director Charles Schultz, and Cyrus Vance, the man Johnson had put in charge of the U.S. Army troops, which he'd sent to Newark and Detroit. And after calling on Vance to give us an up-to-date report on the situation in Detroit, the president gave us our marching orders. He charged us, the Kerner Commission, to investigate the riots and recommend action, again, not only from a law and order standpoint, but also in regard to their deeper causes. Quote, "Let your search be free," he said. "Find the truth and express it in your report." And that is exactly what the Commission famously did, which, as it turned out, not only shocked the conscience of the nation, but greatly upset President Johnson as well. A highly competent and caring Washington attorney, David Ginsburg, was named as the Commission's executive director, and he rapidly hired an outstanding staff, including John Koskinen and others, John here today and a part of this conference, and all of whom it was my great honor to work with. And the Commission set to work in the treaty room of the Executive Office Building adjacent to the White House. We held 20 days of hearings from August to December 1967 with 130 witnesses ranging from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. Contracts were let for serious academic and other studies. Staff members and consultants began to conduct field surveys in 23 cities, including more than 1,200 interviews, attitude and opinion surveys, and other serious studies of conditions and causes. The Commission members broke into teams for site visits to the riot cities and personally observed there, close up, the human cost of wretched poverty and harsh racism. New York City Mayor John Lindsay and I were a two-person team for those site visits, as we had already automatically and almost from the first, despite disparate backgrounds, made ourselves into a close-working two-man team also to take the lead in pressing for the common goals, our common goals for what the Commission ought to do and say. Mayor Lindsay and I went to Cincinnati, for example, for a closed, no-press meeting with a well-educated and successful group of young male and female black militants in a meeting that it had taken our staffs more than a week to set up. None of these young men and women wanted to be there. None would shake hands with us. Nobody would even look us in the eye. One young man expressed the view of all of them when he said he couldn't stand to look at white people anymore. One way or another, all of them said they didn't trust white politicians like us to do anything about racism and poverty. And that included, as one of them said, those racists Lyndon Johnson and Hubert Humphrey. John Lindsay, as a mayor, and I, among other things, as a member with Robert Kennedy of the Senate's Ribicoff subcommittee looking into urban problems, he and I, we already knew that such alienation and hostility existed. But still, this experience affected us greatly. With a local anti-poverty worker, John Lindsay and I, in suits, of course, walked the streets of Cincinnati where the riot and disorders had occurred there. We ran on to a group of young black men idling on the street corners. As a matter of fact, they were shooting craps. Daylight. They instantly gathered around us. "Who are you, FBI?" One asked. We told them who we were and what we were doing there. They all began to say in a chorus, "Get us a job, baby. We need jobs, baby." One young man said, "Mr. Johnson got me a job last summer, but it ran out." He was talking about President Johnson and a summer work program. For John Lindsay and me, as well as for the rest of the Commission, jobs was to become a central theme in our findings and recommendations. Mayor Lindsay and I also went to Milwaukee. I spent the better part of a morning in a black barber shop there in Milwaukee, talking to young black men as they came in. Most were from the South, having come to Milwaukee looking for work, just as local jobs were disappearing or being moved away. The first question I asked the early arrivals puzzled them. That question was whether they found more or less racial discrimination in Milwaukee than there had been in Birmingham or wherever it was in the South they'd come from. They didn't know how to answer because, as I soon learned, In Milwaukee, they didn't see any white people. That's how rigid the local segregation was in that northern city. Mayor Lindsay and I and the other commission members came back from these site visits sobered and somewhat shaken. In a room which I arranged for on the Senate side of the U.S. Capitol building, the commission then began 44 days of meetings from December 1967 until nearly the end of February 1968 to actually write the Kerner Report, every word of which was read aloud, then discussed and revised before being approved by majority vote of commission members. On harder questions, decisions would sometimes turn on a vote of 6-5. In our report, as you know, we condemned violence and lawlessness in the strongest terms, saying that they, quote, nourish repression, not justice. Our basic and most famous finding was our nation is moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. The report stated further, segregation and poverty have created in the racial ghetto a destructive environment totally unknown to most white Americans, and added, what white Americans have never fully understood, but what the Negro, as we said then, can never forget, is that white society is deeply implicated in the ghetto. White institutions created it, white institutions maintain it, and white society condones it. Great and sustained national efforts were required, we said, not only to combat racism, but also to greatly expand social programs, including those against unemployment and low wages, poverty, inferior or inadequate education and training, lack of health care, and bad or non-existent housing. The report also made strong recommendations for improving the conduct of the media and the police, and for needed integration of housing and schools. These recommendations applied to all Americans, quote, rural and urban, white, black, Spanish surnamed, as we said then, and American Indians. But misinformed about its contents and distracted by the Vietnam War, President Johnson rejected the Kerner Report. And this, I think, is particularly sad because President Johnson did more against poverty and racism than any other president before or since. Luckily, our staff had made an early deal with Bantam Books to publish the whole report on its official issuance date, March 1st, 1968, so there was no possibility that it could be suppressed or filed away unread, no matter what. In any event, the report was leaked to the press before the commission could, as planned, background reporters so that they would fully understand the reasons for the commission's findings and recommendations. And we know that it was leaked with bad intent, with the intent to lessen, as the person who leaked it said this in a memo, which was lately found, in order to lessen its impact. The leak resulted in hastily written news stories, which appeared throughout the country the next morning. It was just chaos. The press calling, when I remember, for example, an Associated Press reporter called me and he said, I have a 30-minute deadline. Can you just capsulize the report for me? This is a more than 450 pages report. The result was that the next morning saw shocking headlines. For example, white racism, cause of black riots, commission says. Many people never learned the rest of the story. And not surprisingly, there was considerable backlash in the country. Still, many American leaders spoke out in favor of the Kerner Report, including Vice President Humphrey, Senator Robert Kennedy, my other seatmate in the Senate, and by Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., who called it a physician's warning of approaching death with a prescription for life. The great Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, John Gardner, supported the report. He said, he said that history will not deal kindly with any nation which will not tax itself to cure its miseries. And I think that's true. The Secretary of Labor, Willard Wirtz, had about the best capitalization of it. He said the report is like the words of that great American philosopher Pogo, who said, "We have met the enemy, and he is us." Still, and despite the opposition, America made progress on virtually every aspect of race and poverty for almost a decade after the Kerner Report. Senator Mondale, as the principal author of the Fair Housing Act, had for a long time, with the active support of President Johnson, been trying to pass that act, but was time and again stymied by a Senate filibuster. Then, following the report of the Kerner Commission and strong speeches on the Senate floor by two members of the Kerner Commission, myself and Senator Ed Brooke of Massachusetts, speeches which Mondale asked us specially to make, the filibuster was broken and the act passed the Senate. Thereafter, in the wake of great outrage and sympathy following the tragic assassination of Dr. King, the act was finally blasted out of the House Rules Committee and was enacted and signed into law. As I said, for about a decade following the Kerner Report, we made real progress. For example, as Walter Mondale wrote in the New York Times last April, President Nixon's Urban Development Secretary, George Romney, quote, fought against suburban exclusion, and civil rights organizations like the Fair Housing Alliance worked with administrations of both parties to carry out the fair housing law. We made progress. Neighborhoods and schools were being integrated. Poverty was being substantially reduced. The achievement gap between African American and white students, for example, was being reduced at such a rate that had that rate continued, there would be no black-white achievement gap today. The number of African American and Latino elected officials increased, as did their numbers in the middle class and in all aspects of American life. But with jobs alarmingly disappearing through globalization and automation, with conservative political change and eventually with an unfriendly U.S. Supreme Court and its decisions, as well as congressional cuts in both taxes for the rich and the big corporations, and in programs that benefited poor and middle-class Americans, progress was slowed or stopped and finally reversed. Some improvement occurred, of course, during each of the Bill Clinton and Barack Obama administrations, but regression has been the trend since the mid-1970s, and that's true today. There's still far too much excessive force by police, too often deadly force, especially against African Americans. White supremacists have become bolder and more violent. Housing and schools have been rapidly resegregating, locking too many African Americans and Latinos into slums and their children into inferior schools. As the nation has grown, our overall poverty rate has stubbornly remained virtually the same, while the total number of poor people has increased from a little over 25 million to a little over 40 million. And ever since the 1970s, the African American unemployment rate, for example, has continued to be about double that for whites. Latino unemployment continues high as well. Labor union membership has shrunk from about 25% of private jobs then to about 6% now. Inequality of income in our country has greatly worsened. In the 1970s, the richest 1% of Americans took home something less than 9% of total national income, 9. By 2016, they took home 24%, about a fourth of national income. Wages have stagnated, and the greatest share of all new income in America has gone in recent years to the top 1%. Rich people are healthier, and they live longer. What's fair about that? They get a better education, too. And a better education produces greater inequality of income. Then that greater economic power translates into greater political power. So, where do we go from here? We know what needs to be done, and we know what works. A more progressive tax system, making rich people and big corporations pay their fair share. Stopping tax and spending subsidies that redistribute wealth and income in the wrong direction. Strengthening unions and eliminating the legal and other barriers which impede the right of workers to organize. Raising the minimum wage to a livable wage, which would be a giant boost to the economy and bump up middle-class wages as well. We need more affordable housing, and housing and schools integrated by income and race. Better income for those who can't work and who can't find work. A sound, free public education for all, from early childhood through college. I was looking at the figures the other day. My first year in undergraduate school in 1948, my total semester tuition was $48, virtually free. Health care for all, the basic American principles of equal rights and equal opportunity for all, whatever a person's social standing, zip code, religion, gender, or color. Investment in infrastructure, in science, in alternative energy and technology, investment in ourselves. But how can we get these things done when present times are so politically tough? And they are tough. Our country is in grave, grave danger, as you know. First, I think we can take heart from the fact that the great civil rights movement led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., John Lewis, who I think is a living saint, and others, began in a terrible and depressing time of Jim Crow, which was the law, rigid segregation, and harshest racism. The odds were overwhelmingly against them, but still they courageously resisted, persisted, and ultimately prevailed. We can take heart, too, from the fact that the polls show that the majority of Americans support the measures we must now adopt and the steps which we must now take. We can take heart from the fact that we live in a time of unprecedented, growing, and powerful people's activism, the most activism I've seen in my lifetime, with great new efforts and organizations like the Women's March, Indivisible, and Black Lives Matter, and March for Our Lives. Finally, the Reverend William Barber of North Carolina, founder of the rapidly spreading Moral Mondays movement and a new Poor People's Campaign, is right, I think, when he says, quote, "We can't keep fighting in our silos. No more separating issues. Labor over here, voting rights over there. The same people fighting one should have to fight all of us together." Reverend Barber is pointing the way we must go, showing that white, black, Latino, and other Americans can join hands in coalition with each other and with women, millennials, seniors, the LGBTQ community, immigrants, and others to work for their common interests. Because, in the words of my great old friend and supporter Paul Wellstone, everybody does better when everybody does better. Thank you. Very good. Thanks.
Share for you, and then just hold this out for you.
All right. Thank you.
That was remarkable. Thank you so much. And we have no shortage of really interesting questions for you. You've given us lots to think about.
I know the answers already.
I bet you do. I am going to take the moderator's prerogative, though, and ask the first one, because you said something that really stood out to me. Clearly, most of us, if not all of us, know that oh-so-famous line about we're moving towards two societies, one black, one white. But you said something today that really stands out. You talked about how white societies created this, maintain it, condone it. It's my understanding that millions of people bought the print copy of the Commission's report. What was the reaction to the people on the street? How did the millions who read that react? What's your understanding of what was happening because of that?
Depends on the
statement?
people. Black people, oh yeah, depends on the people, how they reacted. Black people particularly black young people, reacted to it very well. We thought, and this was really controversial within the commission, that we ought to say the word racism. It's the first time any government agency ever said that. Never people on the commission wanted to say a little softer words. Well, let's say intolerance or discrimination or whatever. We thought it was important to say that, particularly for young people. We knew that oppressed people very often come to believe the same bad stereotypes about themselves that the dominant society believes, and they internalize it. And we wanted to say to these black young people in particular, you're not crazy, and it's not you. This is what's going on in the country. And a lot of them found that reassuring. But there were other people, too. For example, my dad, small farmer in southwestern Oklahoma, third grade education. He loved me, but the way he heard the Kerner Report, it was, Mr. Harris, out of the goodness of your heart, you ought to pay more taxes to help black people who are rioting in Detroit. And my dad's response was, to hell with that. I'm having a hard enough time myself. And he was right about that. He said, I'm already paying too much tax. That's true. And he didn't realize that what we were talking about was him, too, as well as black people in the cities. And that was a problem of the way it was released. We came to feel that we made a very bad mistake. We just didn't think about it. Having our hearings as closed hearings. They should have been open to the public. And we should have had press traveling around with us, John Lindsay and me and the other teams, to these places so that people would see just what we were seeing. And they'd come to the same view. As I said, on that racism thing, the vote was 6-5. And it was also true, it was a 6-5 vote on whether or not these riots were the result of a conspiracy. That's what Johnson believed. Johnson talked to me about that. I said to him, Mr. President, that's not so. This during the meeting. I said, there are thousands of H. Rap Browns and Stokely Carmichaels that you and I have never heard of. And I said, I knew he was a student of Franklin Roosevelt, and I said, who knows what kind of uprisings there would have been and what kind of ideologies people would have followed if Franklin Roosevelt hadn't done something about the conditions out of which this discontent occurred. But he said, that's not true. He thought that they were organized, that people like H. Rap Brown and Stokely Carmichael were going around the country and stirring up people. You know, as that sort of thing in the South, a lot of people believed early things were all right until these outside agitators came in here. You know? So, at any rate, that was a 6-5 vote, and I just wind up by saying this. By the time we'd gone through all this together, our report was adopted unanimously. And I wish the public could have seen the things we had seen. David Ginsburg said, this was the only unanimous report that was adopted by a vote of 6-5.
So 2 questions related to what was happening at that time before we turn back to asking you to reflect on the implications for today. Is one very specific question that I'm really intrigued by. Is there a copy of the original staff draft of the Commission report, which was seemingly revised before the formal Kerner Commission report was issued? If there was, you probably wouldn't say so anyway, right?
I don't know of any first draft. What happened was when the Washington Post called and said, we have a copy of this report, and we're going to release it in the morning's Washington Post. We tried to talk them out of it. David Ginsburg and others tried to talk them out of it, and they said no. The Washington Post, Ben Bradley, said, we have it legally, and we're going to turn it loose. And David Ginsburg said, if you do release it, we'll release it to everybody, so you won't have an exclusive. But that didn't deter them. But Al Spivak, who was our great public affairs guy, he was a former AP reporter, he had squirreled away a whole bunch of members, had them in a safe, whole bunch of copies, mimeograph copies of the report. And so they got them out and then distributed them around so that they wouldn't be fragmentary, what the Post would report. But that added, of course, to the confusion in that we released it to everybody as we felt we should. So far as I know, there wasn't any first draft. The way we operated was this. Our staff, led by Dave Ginsburg, would present that day. We met for 44 straight days, as I said, to read and revise and amend and vote on the report. And we'd have before us a draft of that section, and we'd read it, and Dave Ginsburg would read it aloud at the same time. And then we'd discuss it and amend it, perhaps, and then vote on it. And that's the draft there was until we finally had a completed draft.
I wish every Humphrey student could have heard you say that, the work that went into that, to getting it right. Interesting follow-up question. The writer writes, there were 2 black men and 1 white woman on the commission. Please tell us how they voted on this question of using the word racism in the report.
The vote of 6 to 5 was me and John Lindsay. Otto Kerner generally voted only in case of a tie, but he voted in the affirmative on that issue. Roy Wilkins, Ed Brooke, and most of the time Herbert Jenkins. Is that 6? That was the main 6. The 5 that often did not, well, on the tough issues. They eventually came along. Catherine Peden was, I think, a very good person, but she was thinking about running for Senate. She was Secretary of State in Kentucky, and I think she was more worried than I should have been about this report politically. So we couldn't always count on her. But Steve Gillen, who's written this new book about the inner workings of the commissions, has found a letter that I never knew about. Jim Corman got 3 other members of the commission to write a letter to Johnson and to David Ginsburg complaining about how John Lindsay and I were running things. But the 6 includes those that I mentioned.
Thank you. So fast forward a bit to today, well, actually to last year, so about 49 years after the Kerner Commission report, the events in Charlottesville happened. Thinking still about this question of terms like racism and maybe now terms like white supremacy, and expressions like there are good people on both sides of this. Right. So the context that we find ourselves in 2018 is in the aftermath of that. And this questioner writes, if the Kerner Report were commissioned in 2018, all of that other stuff was my parenthetical commentary, how would it be received?
I think about the same, perhaps. Trump is really a symptom of the kind of racism that existed already in the country. And what's different, and this is, I think, very scary, people have, by him and others, become emboldened to speak out. We used to have been, they would have been embarrassed or ashamed to say the kind of things they're doing, and it's gone past that to violence, not just talk. And so I think that you'd have those people much more active, those white nationalists, than was true then. But I think that there's still a great spirit in the country. When the Kerner Commission came out, it was in very recent days of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and there was still a majority in the Congress who were Democratic. And it was really a good spirit in the country yet against poverty and against racism, and that lasted for a while. I think it's out there yet. And I think that we just have to, I think the main thing we've got to do right now is regain democratic control of the House. That's our only hope to begin to change things back.
Thank you. Your optimism, I have to say, is heartening. And when you close by reminding us that a majority of Americans support the measures that we need to see, that's an encouraging sign. This next question is along those lines and is really geared towards the younger people earlier in their career in the room. Humphrey students, they could just as easily be Wilder students or students all over who are thinking about entering the fields of politics or public policy. Why did you decide to leave politics, and what advice would you give to anyone who's considering entering the arena of politics and public policy today?
For me, I thought it was kind of up or out. I could either run for re-election to the Senate.
I should have sent you my 1976 report. It might have helped.
Right. So I wanted to run for president. I could have stayed in the Senate and run for president, but I didn't think that was quite proper. I would have had to take about a year out of my life and do nothing but campaign back home and be away from the Senate and so forth. And I think, and an Associated Press poll showed this, I thought I would have been reelected, but I would be in the Senate. And I'd already been in the Senate, and I didn't think I had a ability staying in there to do the kinds of things that I thought ought to be done. I had also been kind of ruined as a legislator, particularly because of my experience in the Kerner Commission. I really had, I'd gotten to where I wasn't willing to compromise, and the essence of legislative work is compromise. I thought these things were much more urgent than a lot of my colleagues thought, and I thought, as running for president, even a good campaign could have some effect, and so I quit the Senate and ran for president.
And advice, especially now that you
advice.
talk about things like...
Do it. Yes. You know, people... my wife, Margaret Elliston, is the state chair. Yesterday was our 36th anniversary.
Oh, congratulations.
She's the state chair of the Democratic Party in New Mexico, and she calls me her chief of staff. I'm also driving Miss Daisy. My job is a driver. But after the last presidential election, when people like us began slowly to get out of a fetal position, they began to talk to us. You know, people said, what can we do? Margaret thought it was good that she, her 2 degrees, one of them, undergraduate degree, is in political science, and her advanced degree is in counseling. That worked out pretty well. But basically what we said to people was, my mother always said, brighten the corner where you are. Or as Cory Booker says, everybody can do something. And it's therapeutic. You know, you feel like, well, at least I'm doing what I can. It's not my fault. And so that's what we say. And the thing we know, and I think that's what's really basic, is get involved in campaigns. Not only at the national level, but local level as well. The Republicans have seen that much earlier than we did, getting involved in school board elections and city council elections and county commission elections and so forth. So we are partisans, but we are people who believe that you can make a difference best by getting involved in campaigns, and more than that, in running for office. We hear a lot of complaints, people say, well, the answer to that is get involved yourself if you don't like the way campaigns are going, and run for office. It'll kind of awaken you if you do, and make you feel better, and you might even do some good.
Just do it. What was the line at the end of the panel just before lunch? How many Minnesotans eligible to vote did not vote in the last election? That's a sobering thought. There's work to be done. I want to be sure you all have time to get up and stretch before the next session, so we will end it there. Sir,
Could I just add this one thing?
Oh, absolutely. Well, am I going to say no? No. Please do.
One of these things. One time I was up here for a campaign meeting in Minneapolis, and I told this group, I said, my dad came from Mississippi, and I told this group, I said, I'm on my way tomorrow to Mississippi, where in Meridian, I'm going to put together the best and most diverse campaign function that anybody ever had, or the damnedest race riot, one or the other. And when I got down there, there was a packed crowd. It had a lot of people from the Choctaw Indian Reservation nearby, a lot of black people, some of my white kinfolks in Mississippi. And I told them that story, what I'd said in Minneapolis the night before, and I also told them this. When I was 12 years old, I went down to Mississippi with a great aunt and spent about a month down there with some of my kinfolks. And one day they had what was apparently an annual thing for them. They lived in a great old house that had, in times when the family was a little better off than they were when I got there. And they had a black couple, I imagine about 45 years old, came over and they washed the walls. This house was built out of heart pine, wasn't painted inside. They washed the walls with lye water and the floors, and then they washed all of the bedclothes and put them out to hang up, and so they cleaned the whole place. They worked from daylight to dark, and they were paid, this black couple. I was telling this group in Meridian, they were paid a jar of green beans and a bucket of molasses syrup. And I said, that was the reason, though they didn't realize it, why my aunt and uncle were still working for 25 cents an hour. Well, I had a great uncle of mine came up with tears in his eyes, and he said, Fred, I've waited all my life to hear somebody talk like that. I know that you can put people together around their common interests, and I think we've got an obligation to try to do that.
You are a living legend. We're honored to have you here. Hold on. Wait, I've got something for you. We have for the senator a recognition plaque for his time with us today.